So I see now that it is 7:02, so I will get us started officially and continue to admit folks. Let's see here. So welcome everyone. Thank you for signing up for this. I'm Patty Smith, naturalist educator at Bonnievale Environmental Education Center. And for anyone who may be new to Bonnievale, our home base is in West Brattleboro. We have a 200-year-old farmstead there and a couple of miles of trails that are open dawn to dusk. Although currently we are using offices here at Winston Prouty. That's where I am based tonight, but we'll one day be moving our offices back there to Bonnievale Road. The trails feature some very large sugar maples, a beautiful panoramic view, nice meadows, and they are posted against hunting, so you can hike there safely throughout November. Some of the programs that we offer are natural history programs for the public, such as you will enjoy this evening. We also do camps for kids and school programs, science-based nature programs for all of the local schools, salamander crossing brigades, wildlife rehabilitation, and your memberships and donations make all of these things possible. So thank you very much. Tonight, I am so excited to introduce Sean Beckett from North Branch Nature Center, a center that I admire very much. They're based in Montpelier, and they have saw-whet owl research, and Sean coordinates that. So I am at this point going to turn things over to Sean, but just a couple of Zoom tips before we do that. If you have questions along the way, please type them into the chat bar and I will interrupt if appropriate throughout to ask Sean these questions. There may be a chance at the end to ask questions in person if we make it through that. All right. And do keep yourselves muted during the presentation. What am I forgetting, Sean?
That sounds like a good starting place.
Okay, we will start from there and over to you. Thank you so much.
All right, yeah, thanks everybody. It's a pleasure to see some of you and to see the boxes and names of the rest of you. It's a pleasure to be invited by Patty to join you virtually down in Brattleboro. As Patty mentioned, I'm up in Montpelier right now. And we are at the very tail end of our northern saw-whet owl banding season. So I'll be telling you all about that. Let me just pop up our screen share here. Super. And forgive me for looking back and forth. My other screen that has my presentation is off to the side here. So so when I'm looking off this way, I'm actually looking at all of you. So don't mind where my eyes are wandering around. Anywho, so I'm also going to pop up the chat bar here. Okay, we're ready to go. I want to just echo what Patty said. I love questions. Feel free to ask questions all throughout tonight. I like to keep I have all sorts of things I want to tell you about, but we can definitely take the conversation wherever you'd like to go. So my plan is to tell you a little bit about who this little adorable, fierce little predator is, and why you ought to care about them, and why we go through the trouble of catching them and researching them, and what we find out from all of that. So this will be kind of this will be part natural history and life history of this owl. It will be part kind of population biology and understanding some of the research we've been doing, and a bunch more. So we'll jump in. So saw-whet owl. Saw-whet owls are perhaps one of the least well-known owls in Vermont in terms of the ones that people see, right? We actually have 10 or 11 different owls that show up in Vermont, some more regular than others. But of almost anything else out here, barred owls, great horned owls, snowy owls, short-eared owls, eastern screech owls, all these other owls are in Vermont, but saw-whet owls are perhaps one of the most common among them, if not the most common. In fact, I would go as far as to say that they're the most common avian predator in our forests in New England. And yet they are the ones that are often overlooked for reasons that we'll get into. So a lot of owls in Vermont. A quick primer on a couple of the owls that aren't saw-whets, but are probably the ones that if you have seen owls in the wild in your neck of the woods, what you're likely coming across. Probably the most common we have is the barred owl, and this is what it looks like. It's large, it's about the size of a 2-liter bottle with wings, and dark black eyes. The barred owl comes from the name of that comes from the white barring and its back feathers. And this is the one that says, "Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all?" I don't have the right timbre for owl calls in my voice, but you can imagine. This is the "Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all?" owl. And the other owl that we get fairly commonly, especially in the Champlain Valley and down in the Connecticut River Valley, is the great horned owl. So this is bigger than the barred owl by a little bit. And of course has the ears, which aren't actually ears, they're just feather tufts. The ears are kind of tucked behind the facial disc, behind all those feathers. But that great horned owl, those horns there are just the feathers tufts. And these are birds of the open fields. So if you're in an agricultural area and there's an owl perched at the edge of the field and it's big, it's a great horned owl, almost for sure. Actually, let's take things down a size. Let's go to the eastern screech owl. This is the other little bitty owl that we have in Vermont, and they're common in the Champlain Valley, and they're common over in the Connecticut River Valley as well, or at least a little bit more common in the Champlain Valley. But here in central Vermont, up in the kind of the spine of the Green Mountains, there's not an eastern screech owl to be seen. So whenever I travel down to the southern part of the state or over the Champlain Valley looking for owls, I'm always really excited to find eastern screech owls. They're little. They're also cavity nesters. They're maybe the size. Let's see. Maybe if a barred owl is the size of a 2-liter bottle, maybe an eastern screech owl is like the size of a pint glass or something like that. But we're going to go even smaller when we're looking at the saw-whet owl. And a saw-whet owl, this owl could fit comfortably inside of a soda can. They're just a couple of ounces in weight. They're roughly around 100 grams a piece. And even though they are adorable, fluffy, cute, they're very, very common. And yet almost no one has ever seen one in the wild, or at least when I do talks like this, very few people in the audience have ever seen one in the wild. I've been catching saw-whet owls for 10 years now. I have never seen a saw-whet owl in the wild that wasn't one that I just released and landed on a tree. So why are they why are they so hard to find? Well, they spend a lot of time trying to not get eaten by anything, right? When you're the size of a soda can and you have great horned owls and barred owls, and during the daytime you have Cooper's hawks and goshawks and other things out there, not only are these owls predators, but they're also prey themselves. And so during the daytime when we are out able to see birds, they are tucked up into the densest vegetation they could find, maybe tucked into some deep dogwoods, or they often will roost in like cedar trees right up against the trunk and kind of up high, so they just cannot be seen from anywhere. And so they do a really good job of staying nice and obscured. And these saw-whet owls, they're really widespread. If you are in the northern latitudes and you have forests, you are going to have saw-whet owls. So in this map, the purple kind of represents their northern range, their breeding range especially. And you can see that the northern edge of their range really goes all the way up pretty much to the tree line. Once you approach St. James Bay and the Hudson Bay, and you kind of get into the tundra, saw-whet owls kind of drop out. But if you have interior forest, whether that be hardwood forest, whether that be conifer forest, there's going to be these saw-whet owls in here. And so because that habitat is so incredibly widespread across the country, saw-whet owls themselves are incredibly widespread. There's a lot of them up here in the Northeast, in the East Coast, but they also exist over in the West. And I used to work over at the Idaho Bird Observatory up near the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho, catching migratory saw-whet owls that are moving down through the Rockies there, and they come down to the Pacific Northwest as well. So they're very widespread. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about what they look like. So on the right here, this is a juvenile saw-whet owl. And when they first leave the nest, this is what they're going to look like. But very, very soon after that, they're going to molt out of their juvenile plumage and into their kind of adult basic plumage, and we'll turn into the owl on the left here. So this time of year, when we're doing this migration research, all the owls that we see, that we catch, look like the one on the left. So if you ever come across a saw-whet owl and it happens to look like the one on the right, that orange breast and kind of black face, you know that you are standing somewhere near the nesting cavity of that saw-whet owl. So speaking of nesting cavities, saw-whet owls are cavity nesters, and they will use really any cavity of the right size that's available to them. They don't make their own cavities, they can't do that, but they can use the cavities of other things. I think this is one of the most amazing things in forest ecology, is that, you know, if you find a nice cavity in a dead snag in the woods, there can be all sorts of critters paying rent for that apartment year after year after year. You could go to that same cavity one year and it could be, you know, a chickadee could be using that as a nest. You go there another year and there's a downy woodpecker using it. You could go there a third year and there'd be a family of flying squirrels. You come back a fourth year and a saw-whet owl might be nesting there. You can come back a fifth year and it could have been excavated and now there's, you know, a raccoon roosting in there or something like that. And so these cavities, pre-existing cavities, are what these saw-whet owls are looking for. And again, in the interior forest and about 14, 15 feet, somewhere like that, up into the canopy of the trees. So if we were to peer into the canopy, this is what we might find. Now, this is a look into a nest box of an owl that has been fed, that has been given some food by hand, which is, if you look acutely, you'll see there's both mice tails and bird tails. So saw-whet owls, their main food source are voles, primarily voles. We'll get to that in just a second. But here in this nest box is a good representation of what these saw-whet owls look like when they first hatch. They lay like 3 to 7 eggs, somewhere in that ballpark. And you know, February and March is kind of the period in which they're courting and males are in territory and you hear them singing. And then kind of April, they may be laying eggs and incubating those eggs. And then May, those eggs will be hatching. And over the course of May, those eggs those hatchlings will grow and fledge. That's kind of a generalized window, but it can kind of move a couple of months either side, depending on the conditions of the site. Like I've been in, I remember hiking the Long Trail once and being up at Nebraska Notch, which is kind of south of Mount Mansfield, being up at the spine of the greens in the last week of May, and heard a saw-whet owl singing. Which means that there is a male on territory all the way at the end of May. So the nesting season can vary a little bit, but let's just say late winter through early spring. And again, you know, they like any kind of interior forests, right? They would look out at a place like this in the Green Mountains and be really happy about the prospects of finding tree cavities and voles there. They could be out in the Rocky Mountains looking at stands of Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir and be equally happy there. But again, just having a dense interior forest is all they need. And not a lot of forest either, just a couple of acres is all a saw-whet really needs. So I mentioned that they eat voles. So on the left is the range of the saw-whet owl. And again, keep an eye out on that purple piece. All right, like the purple piece is what this is the Cornell range map here, and they're saying that the year-round range of these owls is kind of what's in the purple. You can see it kind of comes across the country and then ducks down into the Rocky Mountains, into the Cascades and Sierras, right? Now check out the range of the southern red-backed vole, which is the primary food source of the saw-whet owl. And you can see there's a lot of overlap between where we find these saw-whet owls and where we find their ideal prey, which are the southern red-backed voles, which are kind of the vole of the forest. So it's not easy. Imagine, you are dropped off in the middle of the woods in the dark, and somebody said to you, okay, if you want to eat dinner tonight, the only thing on the menu is voles, and the only tools you have to catch those voles are your eyes and your feet. And imagine how hard that would actually be. I think actually this could be a really great activity for like an overnight with kids or something like that. Have them like pretend to be owls and try to catch, run around the forest trying to catch voles blindfolded or something like that. I don't know, it's a work in progress, but these owls have some pretty amazing adaptations to be able to do what they do and to be able to actually successfully hunt at night in the middle of the forest. So it's, when we look at an owl kind of broadside like this, we can see some of these adaptations at play that make them so successful. First of all, let's look at those big, beautiful eyes that they have, right? This is true of all owls, but folks might remember hearing that owls can turn their heads all the way around 360 degrees. Well, they can't spin their heads around like a swivel, but they can rotate it like 270 degrees each way. So they can really move. They have a lot of flexibility and dexterity of where they can position their head. And the big reason why they have so much rotation in their neck is because they don't have the ability to move their eyes around in their sockets. Their eyes are so big in relation to the size of their eye sockets that there's no room left for the muscles to control eye movement. And so those big, huge eyes that they have proportionate to their head size allows them to see in incredibly low light. And so, in almost pitch blackness, a saw-whet owl or any nocturnal owl can hunt for a vole just by sense of sight. And when doing so, they do it silently. So think about, maybe the last couple of weeks, if you've been outside and you've heard a couple of geese flying over or a crow flying by or something like that. You hear their wing beats, right? Or a duck flying by, right? You hear their wing beats whistling or like thumping in the air almost, right? If a raven flies by you close, it almost sounds like a fighter jet just going whoosh right by you. And that's because with most birds, when their wing cuts through the air and the air tears over that airfoil, and that the sound that you hear when the wing cuts through the air is from the air tearing. So if you are a prey species, you'd cue into that sound pretty quickly. If you heard that sound coming at you through the woods, you would know to hide. So owls, they have a adaptation around this where the leading edge of their flight feathers has the serration. So this is under a microscope here of the leading edge of the flight feather. So I imagine you can see my cursor. Patty, can you nod if you can see my cursor? Okay, cool. So these feathers right here up on the ones that are kind of facing downwind, if you look at the leading edge of these feathers under a microscope, you see these serrations here. It almost looks like a comb. And what this does is it creates a baffle so that the air isn't ripping across that. It's actually kind of creating vortices. And so the air is kind of broken up as it hits that airfoil. So all that to say that when owls are flying, they fly totally silently. I remember once we were doing an owl playback survey out in the Catskills. We were going to different sites throughout the Catskills, and we'd park in the woods and be nice and quiet for a few minutes. And we'd turn on a broadcaster that would play different owl songs. We would always start with the smallest owl first and work our way up, right? So we start with a saw-whet owl, and then we do a screech owl, and then we do a barred owl, and then we do a great horned owl. You want to make sure you go that way if you're doing these surveys, because if you start with the biggest one, then all the small ones fly away. But if you start with the small ones, then all the big ones come in because they hear the dinner bell, right? Anywho, so we're out there in the woods listening for owls. We played this playback, and we played a barred owl call, and we waited, nothing. We gave it 15 minutes, no owls anywhere. We turn around to get back in the car, and perched 6 feet behind us, right at eye level, is a big barred owl, and it flew in and landed there without making a single peep of noise, just really impressing upon us how effectively they can fly nice and silently. So the wings. So now we get into kind of the real crown jewel of the owl sensory experience here, and that's their hearing, right? We know that we just mentioned that they can find a vole scurrying around on the forest floor in almost pitch blackness with just their amazing sight. But they could also catch a vole scurrying around on the forest floor if they were blindfolded. They have unbelievable hearing. A barred owl that was sitting outside, let's say there was an owl sitting, 10 feet outside my room here on the tree out the window, it could hear my heart beating inside my chest, inside this room. So their sense of hearing is so acute. But in addition to having just very powerful hearing, they have very specialized and finely tuned hearing as well. So they actually have the ability to hear in 3 dimensions, right? We have binocular vision. So we have, a left eye, and at least many of us have a left eye and a right eye, and together we can gauge depth perception. And so I can reach out and grab a coffee cup and know exactly where it is on the first try, because I'm getting 2 different cues from different eyes, and my brain is telling me, okay, it's triangulating the distance away that the object is. The same thing is happening auditorially with owls. So check out the skull, this head-on view of the skull, and you'll see that it's asymmetrical, right? It looks like the skull is lopsided. Well, that's because the ear canals are actually set in different places on either side. So on one side, the ear canal is down low and farther forward, and on the other one, it's set up higher and farther back. And that means when sound hits one ear, it hits it slightly differently and earlier than sound that hits the other ear. And together, this allows them to triangulate noise in space. And then in addition to the asymmetrical hearing, right, owls have that facial disc, right, that flat plate of feathers around their face that give owls their characteristic look, right? But that facial disc is really like a satellite dish that's collecting sound, like a parabola mic almost, collecting sound. Because if you were to take those feathers on the facial disc and just peel them back like this, that's when you can see right down into the owl's ear canal. So they have a huge ear for the size of their head. I mean, their ear canal is like half the size of a human's earlobe, and they're the size of a soda can. Amazing hearing. The vole doesn't stand a chance if you're a saw-whet, right? So that's a little bit about the biology of these owls. I want to turn our attention now over towards the research process that we're doing, and why we go about doing this research, how we go about doing it, and I want to just encourage folks as I'm transitioning here, if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask about saw-whet owl biology and their morphology, really anything you'd like to ask, feel free to throw it in the chat bar here, and I'll see that as we're transitioning. So this here is a picture of a mist net. And a lot of folks, maybe the most common question I get is, how do you actually catch a saw-whet owl? Like, we don't run through the woods with a butterfly net, just like scooping at the trees, trying to catch owls as they fly by. That wouldn't work very well. Instead, we use this tool called a mist net. Now, mist nets are, they are kind of like the evolution of like a gill net for fishing. And in fact, before mist nets existed, especially designed for birds, bird researchers actually used gill nets to try to catch birds. So the same things that you string up across the ocean to catch fish, they use to catch birds. So imagine a net. This net is 40 feet long, and when you stretch it all the way out, it's about 10 feet tall. And we take those nets and we take 4 of them or thereabouts, and we arrange them in a big square in the woods. and we find a place in the woods where there's dense vegetation nearby, and there's trees, but those trees aren't really high. There's not a huge high canopy. The tops of these trees are down kind of low in the 12 to 15 foot range. So like a lot of like these mid areas that have like a lot of mid canopy things like hornbeam, hop hornbeam, serviceberry, even like big viburnum bushes and things like that, hawthorns, apple trees, areas like that where you can have, you know, relatively dense vegetation, but it's not really tall. And that's where we situate these nets. And in the middle of those nets, we have a boombox. So you have these really, and it's you know, it's this contraption that we've designed with all sorts of bits and pieces and parts, and car stereos and Radio Shack megaphones and all sorts of things. So it's quite the science fair project. But what it does is it plays a very loud call of the saw-whet owl. And in fact, let me just bounce backwards really quick. I'm reminded that I have. Here we go. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear that. So that sounds like a truck backing up or something like that out in the woods. Like the last thing you'd expect is for that to be the sound of an owl. And in fact, that once you hear that, once you learn that song, if you're walking around in the dark in late winter, early spring, you might actually recognize that. Again, these birds are very common, but they have a very unusual sound, and so often folks will hear that and they'll just write it off as some kind of mechanical noise or something, you know, from humanity, and not realize that that's actually a saw-whet owl. Anyway, our broadcaster in the middle of these nets plays that exact audio file on repeat for hours, from dusk until about midnight or so. And owls that are flying by during their migration will get really curious about that, and they'll fly down and investigate the broadcaster. And in the process of checking that out, they fly into the net and get caught. So these nets also, let's see. Oh, this is a great question. So the question over here is, do screech owls and saw-whet owls share any similar habitat? Or do saw-whets have to take what screeches pass off, including nest cavities? Oh, I see, yeah. Screech owls and saw-whets do overlap a bit in their habitat. I think screech owls tend to be more, in Vermont at least, tend to be more lowland and kind of hardwood forest, and saw-whets tend to be a little more upland, you know, in the Green Mountains, so maybe a little bit cooler environments. But there is definitely habitat overlap with screech owls and saw-whets in places like the Champlain Valley and the Southern Connecticut River Valley. Yeah, screech owls are a little bit less specific. All a screech owl needs for its life is a cavity, just a tree cavity somewhere. They don't need quite the same amount of interior forest. They don't need as much cover necessarily. They can be a little bit more generalist in what they need. The saw-whets do need a little bit denser, a little bit more forest, a little bit denser forest. I think screech owls often also tend to nest a little bit lower down in the trees compared to saw-whets, which nest a little bit higher up. In terms of prey, yeah, there is going to be some overlapping prey base as well. Saw-whet owls, again, their main prey are these voles. Screech owls are eating voles, but they're also going for mice as well. You know, field mice and white-footed mice and those sorts of things. Shrews, really any kind of small rodent at all. Voles are a bit smaller than mice, and so I wonder if the screech owls are focusing more on mice and saw-whets a little bit more on voles. But it's a great question. Great question with not a very satisfying answer. So when an owl flies into the net, that's not like it's flying into like the net of a tennis court or something like that. It's not just gonna like smack into the net and feathers are gonna go everywhere. These nets are designed for the birds to safely fly into and get kind of caught almost like a catcher's mitt, and then they kind of hang down like in a little hammock. These horizontal lines that are running across the net are called trammel lines, and they're designed to create a pocket of net behind it. So, you know, the wind is blowing here, so you can kind of see what this looks like when it's all bagged out. But if an owl flies into that, it'll then just kind of hang down. You'd think that when owls or any bird is caught in a mist net like this, they would just constantly be struggling and scrambling around and flapping about and just getting tangled into a horrible mess. But 95% of the time, when they fly in there and they get caught in the net, they just kind of sit there and they don't really move. Often it's easier to get an owl back out of the net than it is to get yourself out of the net if you get your buttons and zippers and stuff caught in it. And so it definitely takes some serious training and practice and supervision and permits and all of this to become proficient at extracting birds out of mist nets. But in most cases, extracting a bird from a net is actually a pretty straightforward procedure. And you know, I've probably been involved in catching over 1,000 saw-whet owls now, and you know, we've never had a bird that was injured from this process. The only time that a bird has ever been injured is on a couple of occasions where its wing was tangled pretty bad, and it basically just kind of pulled a muscle in its wing. And in which case we, you know, after we banded it and did all the whole process, we put it in a cardboard box for the rest of the evening, gave it a few hours, and then at the end of the night we released it and it flew away, no problem. But for the other 998 birds, this is you know, totally harmless. I'm sure it's not the owl's favorite day, being caught in a net and then handled by researchers, but it's a very safe process, which is one of the reasons why we feel so comfortable doing it. So we get the owl in the net, we take the owl out of the net, and we put the owl into our owl 6-pack here. This is if for those of you that are familiar with other kinds of bird banding research, mist nets are kind of ubiquitous and kind of a common practice for catching birds of all types. And with songbirds, you take the bird out of the net and you put it in a little kind of miniature pillowcase with a drawstring called a bird bag. But with owls, since they have very sharp talons, putting an owl into a bird bag is only asking for trouble, because then you have to get it out of the bag when you can't see it. And so it can find clever ways to grab you with its feet. So instead, we put them in these contraptions here, which for a size comparison here, these are 2 tomato paste cans that are actually put end to end. And there's kind of 6 of those double tomato paste cans. And there's a breathing hole cut at the other end, but this comfortably and snugly fits the owls in here so that they can be calm and collected and not be struggling around. It allows us to safely transport them back to our research station, where we can then begin taking measurements and doing some of the other processes here. So the first thing we do is we put a band on its leg, and this is really the kind of the meat and potatoes of what and why we're doing this. We're catching these birds so we can put a band on their leg. These bands are issued by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They're all the data that is collected in this process with these bands gets centralized back to the U.S. Geological Survey. Every one of these bands has a unique serial number on it. So it has like a 9-digit code that's essentially like that owl's telephone number forever. And so if this owl shows up anywhere else ever again, whether it's at our station or anywhere else in North America, we can immediately figure out where it came from based on the serial number of that band because of the collective database that we use to be able to keep track of all this stuff. So we affix one of these aluminum leg bands, which is about a gram in weight, so it doesn't affect the owl's lifestyle whatsoever. Just gives it a bracelet for showing off with. Okay, incidentally, I gotta throw this, unrelated to owls, but when it comes to bird banding. So with these owls, like this first bird band here doesn't affect the behavior of these owls whatsoever. There was some researchers down in the Amazon that were doing research on a species of parrot, and they were putting different colored bands on their legs, and the combination of the colors would tell the researchers at a distance which parrot was which. Like this one's like red, blue, green, and this one's green, green, purple, and that one is red, blue, orange, and right. Well, it turns out that the parrots like some colors more than others, and so there ended up being a social hierarchy in the parrot population based on the color pattern of their bracelets, which is not what the researchers intended. But anywho, back to owls. So the next thing we do is we take some measurements on the birds. We measure their wing length and we measure their mass. We take their weight. And this is Zach here, who's measuring the wing of the owl with our special ruler. And then we'll put them, I'll get to that in a second. Then we'll put them in a tomato-faced can on a scale to take their weight. And that combination of the wing length and the mass tells us whether the owl is male or female. As is the case with pretty much all birds of prey, save for a couple, saw-whet owl females are considerably larger than the males. And like pretty substantially so. Like we've caught female saw-whet owls that are in the order of 115 grams at kind of the upper limit, maybe even 120 grams at the upper limit. We've caught males that are in the 70s, like low 70s in weight. So that's, females are 30% larger than the males in many cases, which is pretty awesome. So some research stations, they will take blood samples, or this is a little kind of cheek swab for taking DNA samples. And this is kind of a safe way of collecting DNA without having to draw blood or anything like that. We don't do this at our station anymore, but this is a useful technique for being able to figure out all sorts of isotope analyses and other genetic things. And then comes my favorite part of the whole entire season, which is finding the youngest person in the crowd and giving them the saw-whet owl to release. So this gives you a little bit better idea of how big or small they are in the hand. This research it serves two functions. One is we get to learn a lot about what's going on with these owls, and I'll share that in just a moment. But it also, these owls are incredible environmental ambassadors, right? Conservation ambassadors. They are pretty much the cutest, most adorable thing you can possibly find in the woods. But they're also, it's a safe enough process, and they are safe enough to handle that we can hand off the birds to guests that come to our banding station and allow them to release the bird. And to do that, we have to have them take the bird from us and then go walk off into the dark to let their eyes readjust while we stay in the lights and continue with the banding process. And so just, how often is it these days that, people can have a moment by themselves, alone, quiet in nature, focus on nothing else but that particular piece of the natural world, right? But here's a moment where you can be holding an owl and you have to walk out into the middle of the dark and just sit there doing nothing but looking at this owl for 5 minutes, waiting for this owl's eyes to readjust to the dark. And it's a really transformative thing. And we feel really strongly about this work that we do, just to be able to create moments like this. So the owls are released back to the wild after a small amount of petting and a large amount of photographs and lots of smiles. And then they're off on their way and they continue on their migration. I'm going to transition a little bit now into what we figure out with all this banding data. And I want to talk a little bit, I've been alluding to this migration thing that they do this whole time without actually having really explained that at all. So I wanted to just take a moment to invite questions of folks. If anybody has any questions about kind of the banding process, the safety of it all, any concerns you have, any questions you have, anything like that, feel free to pop a question into the chat bar. We'll also have time at the end too, if you'd like to ask then. So these owls are migratory, and that's really what makes this whole research process possible, right? If we set up this whole system, the nets and the broadcaster and the woods, and did the whole thing, and we put on a barred owl call instead of a saw-whet owl call, the only owls we would catch are the resident pair of barred owls, and that's it, right? Most of the owls in Vermont are non-migratory. In fact, the only one that is migratory is the saw-whet owl. And I guess if you want to count boreal owl as a Vermont resident, you could say boreal owls are a little bit migratory as well. But let's just say that saw-whet owls are really the major migratory owl that come through Vermont. All the other owls are residents. So while this technique would work just fine in other species, at our station, we can get a lot of these owls moving through. Last night, we only caught one owl, but the night before that, we caught 10. And last week we caught like 19 in a single night. So we do this during the migration window of the owls, which in our area is October. And right now we're up to about 135 saw-whet owls for the season, which is pretty cool. Do you catch, I'm reading off the question here in the chat. Do you catch and release during the day at all, like in migration, or is it done only at night? I'm thinking how barred owls, for example, are not just nocturnal. Ah, yeah, thanks. So, so we do not do any of the catch and release during the day. All of our research is happening just at night. Saw-whet owls really are only moving at night. They don't move during the day. Barred owls, you know, can be active during the day, especially in like morning and evening, especially on dim days, especially deep in the inside of the forest. Some owls are more can be more diurnal. Also, if it's like the middle of winter and conditions are really tough and it's really difficult hunting, then sometimes owls have to hunt throughout the day just to be able to survive. They don't have the luxury of only being nocturnal. But with saw-whets, because they are so small and because they're prey species to many things that are larger than them, they don't move during the day. They don't hunt during the day because it's too dangerous for them. And they don't even really migrate on full moon. If there's a bright full moon and it's clear skies, the owls really just kind of hunker down because they'll be seen in the full moon by predators. The other reason we don't do this banding during the day is because they'll be able to see the nets a lot more readily, and so we just wouldn't, even if they were flying in the day, they would be able to see the nets better. So yeah, just a nocturnal migration and just a nocturnal research process as well. I should add that songbirds, when they're migrating, many songbirds, they'll go up high, hundreds of yards into the air and just like hightail it for hundreds of miles over the course of, you know, a single night. That's not how these owls are moving. The saw-whets are really just leapfrogging their way south. Now, where are they going? Shafia, I see your question about how often do you catch already banded owls, and we'll get to that in just a second. So the saw-whets are coming from southern Canada, and really Vermont is kind of at the northern end of their breeding range. But most of the owls that we catch coming through Vermont are coming from Canada, and they're moving through Vermont, and they're going to end up somewhere down in the southern Appalachian states. And then similar is kind of true over here in the Rockies, where they're coming from Canada and they're coming down through the Rockies down into the Cascades, and they're going to be wintering down in Northern California or along the coast, kind of more temperate conditions. Really what they're looking to do is get away from deep snow, right? If you're the size of a soda can and you're trying to catch voles, it's not really very easy for you to do so underneath if there's 3 feet of snow between you and the vole. Barred owls and great gray owls and other larger owls have no problem with that. They can just punch right through the snow to get to their food, but saw-whet owls are too small for that. So they're just looking to move south to get to a more hospitable place to hunt. For some owls, that means they go from St. James Bay, you know, up in Quebec, and they just winter in Vermont. We actually do have saw-whets that winter in Vermont. But then the saw-whets that summer here, they might go all the way down to Georgia, perhaps. So there's this interesting kind of leapfrog migration that happens. But suffice it to say that they're starting up north and they're ending up down south. And this map here, Nikki, yeah, where is your banding station? Is that at North Branch? Yes, at North Branch Nature Center, right there in Montpelier. Our red dot is not on this map because this map is an old map, but they haven't updated it. Every dot on this map is a banding station that's doing the exact same thing that we are, with the same protocols and the same, catching the same owls, basically. And so, you can see that if we catch an owl at North Branch and we let it go and it continues south, there's plenty of other opportunities for it to, depending on how far it goes, there's plenty of opportunities for it to wind up at another banding station somewhere else. And this is where things get really, really interesting, is when you ban an owl and that owl is seen somewhere. So some of the research that we did, this is like 10 years old now. Oh, great question. Hang on. All right, so David, how do they migrate? Do they use the sun, the stars, magnetic fields, etc.? Birds have a whole suite of techniques that they use for migration. Some species use the sun, some use the stars, some use the magnetic field, you're right. And what different species use depends on the species and when they migrate and where. And so there's not like one easy answer there. But with saw-whet owls, really the driving one is natural migratory corridors. North-south running features are how they kind of go from point A to point B. So they're following lake shores, they're following ridge lines, they're following rivers. So our nature center is situated on the north branch of the Danuski River, which runs north-south from, excuse me, Elmore all the way down to Montpelier. And there is kind of a corridor of mountains on either side running north-south. So we're kind of like this funnel where owls that are coming from across northern Vermont are funneling into this north-south river valley, and our station's right in the middle of that. There's other stations that folks that used to work with us that have gone to start their own stations up at like Sterling College and Johnson State College farther north, and they catch very few owls at those stations because they don't have a clear geographic kind of funnel happening. So anyway, yeah, so they're primarily following mountains, rivers, etc. So what we did is we took all of, we got all the data from the USGS bird banding lab. We asked for every saw-whet owl that had ever been banded ever for all time. And they sent us an Excel spreadsheet with 250,000 rows on it. And so we sorted through that to figure out which birds have been seen more than once. And we took all the birds that had been banded in one place and recaptured somewhere else, and we drew a line between those 2 points, and this is what it looks like. Now, sometimes there's multiple years between banding and recapture, so it's not like there's all these birds moving east to west. These are birds that were banded in one place one year and then recaptured over here somewhere else, for instance. But generally speaking, like this is where things get really interesting, is looking at where birds are going to, where they're coming from. Now, if we take this box of like spaghetti we've dropped on the map here, and we just isolate North Branch Nature Center's first 5 years of banding, this is what the picture looks like for us. So these represent birds that either we banded and were recaptured somewhere else, or birds that were banded somewhere else and recaptured by us, and could be in separate years. And this has really taught us some pretty cool things, right? We had this one bird here that we banded at North Branch, and then the following year it was banded way over here in Wisconsin. This is a super outlier in the data. This is really cool to have a bird that has, wound up over 1,000 miles, almost 2,000 miles west of where it started. And so what happened, right? Let's say the bird summered up here. It nested up here year one, and it migrated south, and it hit the St. Lawrence River, and it came down Lake Champlain, and it came over the Green Mountains, and it got caught at North Branch, and we banded it. We banded it and let it go, and it continued its way south. It wintered somewhere down here in, let's say, North Carolina. And then it migrated back north up to the next year, and it spent the next summer, maybe it nested over here the next summer. And then fall migration year 2 comes around, and instead of migrating down along the Appalachians, it goes this way, and it goes through the Great Lakes and gets caught way over here in Stevens Point. So this record kind of showed us that that most birds are following the same migratory corridors from year to year, but some actually do jump over between migratory flyways, depending on where they're nesting. But yeah, so it's fun to be able to catch birds that recapture birds that come with a story attached to their leg. So what I want to do is actually go into a couple of more recent examples, and some of the interesting things that we're able to figure out from this massive data. And attach this to particular owls that have a neat story. So, for instance, last year we caught a bird at North Branch, and that bird was banded for the first time in 2016, way down in Maryland. So that is more than 4 years between banding and recovery. And actually that bird was banded as a 2-year-old bird. We can tell the age of the bird by its feather patterns when we catch them. And so it was banded as a 2-year-old, and we recaptured it 4 years later. So this was wild, because these saw-whet owls we thought didn't live very long. So what we did was we took all of the data of all these birds that had been banded and recaptured, and we asked ourselves, how long is it on average between when they're banded and when they're recaptured? We can tell if a bird is, by looking at the bird's feathers, we can tell if it's a hatchier bird, we can tell if it was born that year, or we can tell if it's 1 year old, but we can't tell after that how old it is. A 3-year-old and an 8-year-old bird and everything in between all look the same. So we were able to use banding data to figure out how old are these saw-whet owls on average. And what we figured out is that most birds, 91% of saw-whet owls that are ever recaptured, are recaptured less than 3 years or less after they're originally banded. And then the chances of capturing it ever again after that become more and more and more diminished. And so this is just goes to say that this almost shows like a survivorship curve for saw-whet owls, where they're, you know, if somebody asks me how long do saw-whet owls live, well, we could say generally about 3 years is statistically about the top. So how long they're going to live, maybe older if they get lucky. And this is information that we can only really figure out through this banding data, because I mean, how else are you going to figure this out? Just like stare at a saw-whet owl in the woods for 9 years and, you know, count the days. I mean, you could do this in captivity, but to figure this out in the wild, banding data is really helpful. So bird number 2, we captured a bird last year on October 14th. Exactly 1 month later, November 14th, it turned up at Highland Retreat Center in Virginia, 503 miles away. So this gave us a great indicator of how fast these birds are migrating, right? It took a month to go 500 miles. And so, you know, we took this information from this owl and we asked ourselves, okay, what does this migration really look like? On average, are these owls moving quickly through the Appalachians? Are they moving slowly? Like, what's going on? And so what we did was we took the eastern seaboard and we basically imagine like this ladder across the eastern seaboard, and each one of these ladders is a latitude line, right? So we took all of the owls that were banded within each latitude bar and asked ourselves on what day is the average day that you're going to catch the most owls. So if migration is like a bell curve, where's the top of that curve hitting at each one of these latitude bars? And this is kind of what we figured out, is that, you know, up here in southern Ontario, the saw-whet owl banders are really hitting the peak of their migration around October 1st. In Vermont and, you know, central Vermont especially, our peak is around October 15th. And then down in New York, southern New York and Massachusetts or like Maryland and thereabouts, they're getting their big peaks right now. And then the birds that continue on farther south into the Carolinas, you know, those will show up down there mid-November. So this effort of just looking at when these owls are caught and then stratifying that across latitude helped us figure out, you know, how fast are they moving? And this is kind of a map showing that. Oh, Nikki, that's really interesting. The saw-whet that was at Southern Vermont Natural History Museum was over 11 years old, but is in captivity. That's fascinating. Yeah, the oldest bird that has ever been recaptured after being banded, I think, was 9. And that's like 1 out of 3,000 records made it that long. Let's see, I'm just checking my time here. Okay, got a couple more minutes. I'll share with you another fun bird. So we did this pre-pandemic back in 2018. We did a youth naturalist retreat up to the Northeast Kingdom when we stayed at this beautiful hut up on the Milhegan Basin. And we decided it would be fun to put up our owl nets there as an evening activity. So we put up the nets, and one net check, we caught 3 owls. And we banded them, we let them go. And a month later, they were captured down in Pennsylvania, and they were recaptured by Scott Weidenzahl. So those of you that are birders or you know, like reading or any intersection of those two things, you might know Scott Weidenzahl is one of the kind of premier authors on birds and birding and just kind of popular science around birds that there is today. And so it was really cool to be able to introduce, by doing this process, not only were we introducing kids to the owls, but that we were introducing them to conservation heroes in the Northeast, which is really fun to have him be our like owl pen pal here. So, this activity got the kids thinking a lot about like, how are these owls moving? Are male owls and female owls moving differently? Are adult owls and juvenile owls moving differently? And so we started doing some more GIS work with those latitude lines, and asked ourselves, what's the male to female ratio of owls that we capture? And how does that change? Really interestingly, almost all of the owls that we catch are females. Now, out there in the wild, the sex ratio of owls is 50-50. There's going to be the same number of males as females in the wild. But at our stations, we only ever catch, we catch mostly females. Of the 130 owls that we've caught this year, maybe a handful are males. And that's true. That heavily female skewed ratio at the banding stations is true across all banding stations. Probably because that broadcaster that we play is preferentially attracting females or preferentially repelling males, one or the other. We haven't figured this out. But what is true is that even though we catch mostly females, the male to female ratio does, oh, Erica, how do you know that the ratio in the wild is 50-50? Pretty much every species, this is kind of like a biological rule that the male to female ratio is almost always 50-50, unless there's some really weird, unusual reason for that not be the case. Or some strange management thing that's happening, like deer hunting, for instance. There's probably more does than bucks because of how deer hunting regulations are structured and how population management objectives are being aimed at. But unless there's something really weird going on in terms of how we manage that species, or something really unusual going on in terms of that species' reproductive story, the sex ratio is going to be 50-50. And I think this is true in almost every bird species. I'm trying to think of a counterexample in almost every mammal species. So in other words, we have no reason to believe that they aren't 50-50 in saw-whet owls. Also, if you do go to the exhausting trouble of putting up mist nets without a broadcaster, and you just string up 30 nets across the forest and just cross your fingers, you will catch some saw-whets. Not very many, but the people who have done that, they do catch us even sex ratio male to female when that happens. So anyway, but the story that we figured out is that even though that's skewed towards females, there is still a difference in terms of how many males we catch. We found that farther north we catch more males, and farther south we catch fewer males. We always catch a lot more females than males. I see it's getting late. I'm kind of mixing my words here. We always catch more females, but the farther north you go, the more males are showing up in the mix. And so we were suspecting maybe that this might be because, if males are trying to set up territories, it benefits them to not migrate very far so that they can return to that territory quickly in the spring, get on territory, right? If you're a male and you're trying to nest up in Ontario and you spent the winter in Georgia, then by the time you've made it all the way back up for the nesting season, you might have lost out on your prime spot. This is the same reason why, like red-winged blackbirds, the males show up way before the females by like a month, because they're trying to get up there to set up territories in advance of the female's arrival. So anyway, this banding data starts revealing patterns around the differential movements of males versus females, adults versus juveniles, how fast they're moving, why, etc. And then our favorite owl, who is now a member at North Branch Nature Center, we caught this bird 1104-34470. We banded it in 2017. We recaptured in 2018, and we recaptured it again in 2019, which is extremely rare for a bird to be recaptured not once but twice. Yeah, I think the last, and so like maybe the last thing I'll say here before I turn it over to some more questions is this prompted the question in us: are owls following the same migration corridor year to year? We had that one outlier of that bird showing up in Stevens Point, Wisconsin, and then we have this one outlier of a bird being caught 3 times at our own nature center 3 years apart. Which is more likely? So we looked at all the birds that were banded in one place and recaptured again, and we looked at the distance between those 2 points. And what we found, this is a little bit difficult to interpret, but let's see, 65 to 70% of all saw-whet owls that were recaptured were recaptured less than 50 kilometers away from where they were banded in previous years. And just for reference, the 50 kilometers is the distance from Burlington to Montpelier. I should have come up with a Southern Vermont analog for that, but you know, and then over 70% are recaptured less than 100 kilometers away from where they originally banded. So what this data was showing is essentially that owls are tending to follow the same migratory corridors. They're most likely, year after year, if they're going to be recaptured, they're most likely to be recaptured in the same kind of flight path where they were the year before, and not somewhere way off somewhere else. So every talk ends with something like the end. And so here's the end of an owl sticking out of a tomato paste can. We're about to put it on the scale over here in the distance to weigh this. And I think it's also fun to just notice that, you know, when we look at a picture of a bird in the bird book, one of the hardest things for a illustrator to do in creating a bird book is to draw a picture of not a robin, but the archetypal robin of all time, because birds look even within a species, birds look different from one another. You just like you can recognize your own cat or your dog against neighbors. You know, these are all saw-whet owls, but they all kind of have a little bit of a different personality, a little bit of a different look to them, and I think that's one of the most fun things about catching these owls, that each one comes with its own unique personality of what you're going to get and how it looks, and so I thought this would be fun to end things on. So let's see. I'll stop there and stop sharing my screen, and I'll say thank you to everybody for sticking with us for the hour, and thanks again, Patty and Bonnie Vale, for inviting me to join you all this evening. And Patty, if you have time for some more questions, then I do too. I'd be happy to stick around.
Yeah, a few minutes. If anyone has questions, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask away. You answered everybody's questions.
Okay. I have a question.
Go ahead, Pam.
It's to Patty. So our nearest saw-whet banding stations, one's in Williamsville, was that correct? I saw on the map. And one is in Winchester, New Hampshire.
Ah,
Did you notice that? So there's none other than that? You don't have one, obviously.
no.
No. But I saw on the map, yeah, it said Winchester, New Hampshire. I think we all know where that is from Brattleboro, and Williamsville, we definitely know where it is. So I'm imagining is that it, but I guess you're not sure. So
Yeah, no, I have no idea. Actually, I didn't know there were any around
well,
here.
get Sean maybe to send you the map again, and you can look, because they put them around. I'd be like to go.
Yeah.
One of them if it's nearby.
Yeah, I would say many of these banding stations do public banding demonstrations, and we do up at the Nature Center. So if you want to make the long journey late at night to come visit us in Montpelier, you're welcome.
If I can make a shorter journey to Williamsville or Winchester, I could do that too. But I'd love to come to your place sometime. Yeah,
there's a lot of places down in your neck of the woods. Unfortunately, I don't know what those places are, but I'd be happy to do a little reconnaissance with the saw-whet owl banders. We're all kind of connected through this network called Project OwlNet. This network came together to standardize our methods, standardize our just become better at doing this more safely and whatnot, and also do things like this where we can bounce off like, oh, are there any banders down in northern Massachusetts or southern New Hampshire that do programs? So I can reach out to folks for you, and Patty, I can get back to you with that'd
be great.
Some options.
I'm sorry I'm taking up all the time here, but my friend Annie, who is also on here, has been to a banding session. Did you tell me that? Annie, you have to unmute. Alt-A. They told me to hit Alt-A. There you go.
Yes. Yeah, it was several years ago, and I think it was in Upton or Shrewsbury, Massachusetts. But it was a wonderful experience, and we were given the owls to release, and we fell in love with these little owls. Interestingly, they used bird bags. They didn't have, I guess, the tomato paste cans at that point, but
the cans are something that we designed. And so there's only a couple of folks that use that, but it is so much better than bird bags. Yeah, with bird bags, you get to the end of the season, your hands are just covered in little holes from talons. I had another point. One kind of fun tip, because they're so responsive to playbacks. One thing you could do during the migration season in your area, go to the woods, nearby, wherever you got, and get a big pot of hot chocolate or something like that, and get a Bluetooth speaker or any speaker, and put on repeat the sound of a saw-whet owl, and let it go for an hour or so, and then just walk out to it with some bright flashlights, because they'll hang out around the speaker. And oftentimes when we go down to our nets, you can see owls in the trees on a good migration night. So I should also add that when they're migrating, the best migratory conditions when we expect to see them most is middle of October, so the middle 2 weeks of October, and after a bunch of nasty weather has gone through, particularly a cold front has come through, and it's nice cold conditions with a wind coming from the north after nasty weather has gone by the previous days, middle of October. And if you put a speaker out in the woods loud with a saw-whet call, and leave that on for an hour, and you go out and check it, you're likely to see saw-whets around it. So that'd be a great way to try to see. And this is a common owling technique in general, of trying to find owls by doing playbacks. Now, in terms of etiquette, you don't want to do that every night. You don't want to do that for very long. See the owls, have your moment, and then turn it off and let them be back on their way, so that we're not bothering wildlife.
Patty, why don't you host? You need more to do. Why don't you host one of those some evening?
I need more to do.
You need lots more to do. You're doing nothing.
I have a question about their return trip. I'm used to hearing saw-whet owls in late February and March, and I'm assuming that's when they're returning north. When are they on their return trip, and what's that habit like?
Yeah, I think of their return trip as being timed around sugaring season. So I think, especially the tail end of sugaring season, once the snow starts to really melt out a bit, that's when they start moving through. And the reason that we don't do spring saw-whet owl banding, or I should say the return journey banding, is because that migration is much more diffuse. It's over a much longer period of time. So I've done some banding or in sugaring season and had success, but there's still owls that are kind of working their way north in April. And so it's just such a staggered start to the breeding season. It's also a staggered start to the northbound migration season as well. Does that answer your question? Okay. Great. Nikki, I saw. Yep.
Yeah, I was lucky enough 2 winters ago. I have bird feeders about 8 feet in front of my windows. And for 2 nights, I had a saw-whet come and perch on the feeders. And I have tons of pictures, including it catching a mouse. So I didn't know if you were interested in any of those. And if you did, I would be glad to take your email. Also, then I put up a box. Do you have any suggestions? As far as I know, they have not nested in the box. Do you have any suggestions on having a box and attracting them?
Well, I would love the photo of a saw-whet eating a mouse, if you're willing to share it. My email is for everybody. My email is Sean, S-E-A-N, Sean at northbranchnaturecenter.org.
Okay,
So
thank you.
Happy to field any of your saw-whet owl questions. So thank you for that. And then in terms of the nesting boxes, in college, I put up 100 nesting boxes across the Catskills. We had 0 saw-whet owls using them, even though we know that saw-whet owls nest in the Catskills. We had lots of flying squirrels. We had lots of all sorts of things. But we know that the protocol we were following was like the recommended thing you're supposed to do for saw whet. So like we carried a 14-foot ladder through the woods, and we hung it at the top of the ladder. So, you know, somewhere in that like 12-foot height area. And then the opening should be facing into the shades. Like the opening shouldn't be facing into like the opening of the box should not be like facing into like a big like forest canopy opening or something. It should be like that should be a shaded side.
Mhm.
The boxes themselves, I think, are like 14 inches tall, maybe, and the entrance, I think the entrance hole is 2.5 inches in diameter, maybe, and yeah, and then, you know, just in the interior forest, on trees that seem to have good flight paths into them and easy for them to access. So yeah, that's all I got on nest box placement.
I haven't even gotten squirrels in this box, so who knows? But I'll leave it up there. Why not? Thank you.
Yep. I see a question in the chat here about banding stations in Southbridge, et cetera. And I don't know enough about banding stations to our south to be able to answer about that. So yeah, I'll look up and see if I can find some other stations for y'all to visit down in your area.
I should probably let Sean get on with the rest of his evening, and you can email him your questions now. And thank you all so much for coming. And thank you so much, Sean. I learned a lot about saw-whet owls. That was so exciting.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, Patty. And y'all should join Patty over at the Nature Center in February for talk about beavers.
That's right.
So we're happy to share. Well,
Thank you.
thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Good
John,
night, everyone.
night.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Francis Doyle, is that you?